A miter border, I think of it as a picture frame. It's a frame that goes all the way around your block, your quilt, and it's cut at a 45-degree angle like a picture frame. So I want to show you how to pre-cut that. Most people would avoid a mitered border, but I think this technique will help you get over that and you'll enjoy mitering a border. The very first thing that you need to do, even with that we learned in a previous lesson, that you will need to press your block completely pressed on the back side so that the seam allowances are going the correct direction, and then you press it back from the front so that you don't have any fabric in the fold. Now we're ready to measure your block or your quilt. So with your tape measure, and you can either measure with a tape measure or a ruler, just as long as you are measuring 3 places in the middle. So I'm measuring 3 places in the middle across the block to get the average both directions. So that I'm measuring from raw edge to raw edge, 3 places in the middle, not measuring right against the edge because that may be stretched out just a little bit and pressing. So now we've got our average. And again, I like to keep my notepad, my calculator, and my pen handy so that I can write the measurements down, because we have a formula for pre-cutting this mitered border. When I first started sewing mitered borders, I would sew on a strip and have quite a bit left over, extra. And then I would fold those 2 pieces over and draw a line. Occasionally that worked. Occasionally, more often than not, it didn't. So this method, you're pre-cutting those pieces the same way that you have pre-cut your pieces within the block. So you'll have a much more accurate mitered border instead of a hit and miss border. So with this formula, your average length and width of your block or your quilt, the first thing that you'll do is subtract 1/4 inch. So my block is 10.5 inches. The very first thing I'm going to do is subtract 1/4 inch. That gives me 10.25 inch. The next thing I will do is divide that number by 2. That's why I like to keep my calculator handy, because I may not be able to figure this out in my head. So I'm going to actually divide 2 into 10.25, which gives me 5 1/8 inch. So now the reason that I have divided that in half is because we're going to cut the strip folded. It's going to be folded in half. So I have my 1 strip. I'm just going to cut one of my borders at a time. So here I have my strip, and this is from selvage to selvage, so it's about 40 inches long, but I know that my border is only going to be slightly longer than the block. So I don't need to cut at the fold. I'm going to overlap this fabric slightly. And I want it just a little bit longer than the 5 1/8 plus the width of my strip that I've used. So the width that I've stripped, I've just chosen a strip size that I think would fit this block well, just so that it's framing at a nice size. It can be large or small, and that depends on the size quilt too, and your block as far as how wide you want to cut your strip. So now I am just overlapping this slightly, because I do want to be able to get 2 strips out of this one, 2 of my borders out of this one cut. So now with my pen, I like to keep my pen straight, handy with me. I'm going to measure 5 1/8. So I've positioned the ruler at 5 1/8, even with the fold of the fabric. I'm going to place a pin right at the end of the ruler, right on the edge of that strip. I don't want to pin into the fabric because I don't want to add any space. So now with the ruler, I'm going to position it so that the 45-degree line is even with my bottom strip, because I'm angling it outward, and I have it even with the pin. And I'm just holding that pin in position. I'm just holding it up. I'm not pinning into to add any space. So now I'm going to remove my pin, and with my rotary cutter, cut this angle. So this is my strip. I'm going to, since it's folded and I know that's exactly in the middle, I'm going to put one of my pins right there to mark that middle. And as you can see, now we have a strip that has my middle mark and my angles going outward. When I first started trying to pre-cut a mitered angle with a 45-degree angle, I would cut the 45-degree angle, measure across, and I would forget if I had which direction I needed to cut. So I found that by folding the strip in half, then I'm cutting one time, and that is less room for error. Okay, now we're ready to mark this border. And I'm going to mark it on the back side, and that's when I'm going to use the tools to mark 1/4 of an inch. If you feel comfortable eyeballing where 1/4 of an inch is, we want to know where 1/4 of an inch intersection, 1/4 of an inch from this raw edge, and 1/4 of an inch from this raw edge. And we'll make a mark there. And I have several tools. If you feel that you cannot eyeball it comfortably, then you can use this tool. This is a Jenny Beyer Perfect Piecer, and it has the various different holes marked for the angles. And we want to use this line right here. We're matching up the line with the raw edge of the fabric and the ruler with the raw edge here. So depending on if your fabric is light or dark, so you can mark it with a mechanical pencil, and all I'm doing is just marking the dot there, or if you have fabric that is fairly dark, then you can use a sew line pencil that has a white lead or a colored lead. So I'm going to mark this tip, that 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to flip it over and mark the other corner. So I'm just making that mark so that that tells me exactly where that 1/4 of an inch is. Now I have another tool that's also serves the same purpose. So it just depends on which tool you're the most comfortable with. And this is a Jan Krantz ruler. And it has one hole, but it has several different lines, and you'll match the fabric angle that you have cut with the line that's on your tool. So here I am following the line even with the ruler and making that mark, flipping it over. Now I'm marking the other end, the opposite end, with my 1/4 of an inch tool. You'll do that for the remaining 3 identical borders so that you have 4 borders exactly alike. Now I want to mark the 1/4 of an inch of my corners of my block, your block or your quilt. And I'm going to do the same thing. With this tool, I have a square corner, and I'm just going to match the tool with the fabric, mark one end, mark the opposite end, flip it around. So I'm matching the tool with the shape of the fabric that's underneath. Okay, so now I've marked my borders and I've marked my block. So now I'm ready to pin. We've already pinned our blocks in half and marked with a pin. So now I'm going to fold I've folded the borders in half and marked the border with a pin. Now I'm going to fold the block in half and mark that with a pin. I'm going to do opposite sides first. So I've pinned opposite side because I want to sew sides first and then top and bottom last. And I like these long, thin pins because they're long and flexible and they're thin. They're the glass head clover pins. So now I have my border that's marked. I'm going to match my middle mark here. And I'm just putting a pin. Now this is important because you've marked that 1/4 of an inch and you need to pin exactly where that 1/4 of an inch is. And I like to pin one at a time, so I'm pinning through one layer, one fabric at a time. So I'm going through exactly where my dot is that I marked, slide it onto the pin, which is nice to have a long shaft pin, and I'm going to pin through where my mark is and slide that onto the pin. So I'm matching raw edge even here. And I'm going to do the opposite end. And I really like the long, thinner pins, not these thicker pins for this. Every pin has a purpose. So I'm pinning through again where my dot is, and then pinning through the second layer where that dot is. Matching the raw edges. And if you need to pin again, if you feel that there's a little bit of fullness on one side, then you can pin at the 1/4 inch marks, also at the quarter marks. So I would pin the other side. Now, in the very beginning, when we subtracted a 1/4 inch, you were probably thinking, well, why are you subtracting a 1/4 inch first? You understood the divide by 2, but the 1/4 inch to subtract the 1/4 inch first is because you'll have an 1/8 inch here and an 1/8 inch here that you can see the block. You can see the little white 1/8 inch, so that's the excess. So I have an 1/8 on one side and an 1/8 on another side. That's that 1/4 that you subtract in the very beginning. So for a mitered border, you subtract a 1/4 inch from the average block, then divide by 2. Now we're ready to sew your mitered border, and we're going to sew opposite sides first. And because we took such time in pinning, and that needs to be very accurate, your stitching needs to begin right at that pin. We're not going to start sewing right at the raw edge like we do on most sewing, but we're going to start at the 1/4 inch mark and we're going to back stitch. So I'm going to bring my needle down, and I'm bringing it right down at that pin, not on the back side, but on the inside of the pin closest to me. And I'm going to take one stitch, and I'm going to take 1 or 2 stitches up, then I'm going to back stitch to the pin, but not past the pin. You need to become familiar with your machine so that if you know that when you stop sewing, when you've backstitched, that your machine takes an additional stitch, then be ready for that, because you don't want to take a stitch past the pin into your seam allowance. So now I'm going to sew all the way down to the pin at the bottom, and sometimes because I'm sewing with these thinner pins, I can sew right over them, but do what you feel comfortable. If you don't want to sew over pins, then don't do that. But when you're sewing up to the pin, you're not going to sew past it. So I'm one more stitch, bring it down at the pin, then I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to do that on the opposite side so that I have 2 borders, on one on each side. Then I'm going to go top and bottom, and then we'll come back right after that. Begin stitching at the 1/4 inch pin. Take a few stitches, then back stitch, but not past the pin, which is the seam allowance. Stitch all the way to the last pin. Stop at the pin and back stitch to secure stitches. Finger press after sewing each border. Fold the middle of the remaining sides and mark centers with a pin. Place border over block matching center pins. Repeat for all 4 sides and sew border opposite sides first. Last, to sew mitered angle, finger press away from border strip. Pin each layer where previous seam ended, catching only the border ends. Begin stitching at the 1/4 inch mark and back stitch. Stitch all the way off. No need to back stitch as exiting the seam. Press quilt or block toward the border. Now I've sewn my mitered corners. Now we're ready to press. And again, I like to press from the back, make sure that the seam is going the direction that I want, and we're going to press towards the border. And because we haven't stitched in the seam allowance, the seam around that mitered angle can go any direction, whichever way it's going to lay the flattest. So we're going to press this. Some people like to press their mitered angle open, and if you feel that that's going to lay the flattest for you, then that's fine also. So I'm pressing outward towards the border that we've just sewn. And this is the same if it's a block or if it's a large quilt. So I'm going to press all the way around. And I'm just letting the iron do the work. I always like to release my hand from the iron, and then I don't wear myself out, and I don't distort the block. I don't distort the piece that I've just sewn a border on. Okay. Now we're going to flip it over, And I want to press again. Now I'm pressing from the front, and all I'm doing is just letting the iron do its job. Now if you feel that you have a little bulky part, maybe when you were back stitching, your machine took an extra stitch and so you may have just a little bit of a thickness right there. This is when I use my favorite tool, and it's called the whacker. And it will make anything flat as far as pressing it. So I will steam this out, steam it, get that corner nice and hot that is just a little odd corner, and then hit it. And it's nice and flat. And you'll do this, I use the whacker a lot for if I have a block that has a lot of points that are coming together. But when you have a mitered angle like that, sometimes it just needs to be pounded into submission. So just take it out on the block.